Hello and welcome to the Biology 6 lecture on biological macromolecules. Now, this lecture on biological macromolecules is pretty long. It goes around 2 hours. And so I'm going to split it into two lecture videos. This first one, which is you can see titled here is titled Lecture 4A, is about the first hour of the lecture. So this is part one. And the second video for this biological macromolecules lecture is the second part, and that will be called Lecture 4B. Now let me come back to this, start off with this concept right here. This is the hierarchy of biological structures. And remember, it basically, this concept of hierarchy of biological structures basically talks about what are the parts of the body. At the smallest level, we have atoms, things like carbon atoms, oxygen atoms, hydrogen atoms, and nitrogen atoms. But in the body, those are oftentimes linked together into, well, atoms stuck together, which we call molecules. And then molecules are the building blocks of cell organelles. The parts of cells are the cell organelles, and the cell organelles are the parts of cells, and cells are the parts of tissues, and tissues are the building blocks of organs, and organ blocks are the building blocks of organ systems, and organ systems are the building blocks of the human body. Well, we're in the part of the semester where we are talking about molecules. What are the molecules of the human body? And in the previous lecture, we talked about the most abundant molecule in the human body, and that, of course, was water. We are about 50% water by weight, and you have a lot more water molecules in your body than any other type of molecule. Okay, but other than water molecules, what are the molecules of our body? Well, other than water molecules, pretty much all the other molecules in our body are what are called organic molecules. And organic molecules are molecules that have carbon atoms. So this molecule that you're seeing right here is an example of an organic molecule. So if it has carbon atoms as part of its molecular structure, it is an organic molecule. And if it's an organic molecule, it has carbon atoms as part of its structure. Now, incidentally, when you go to the grocery store, there might be the organic foods section. Those are foods that are healthier. They don't use pesticides or genetic modifications. In this context, the word organic does not necessarily mean healthy. Some organic molecules are quite poisonous. In this context, organic molecule just means a molecule that contains carbon atoms. Now, incidentally, as you can see from this illustration, it's okay for organic molecules to have some non-carbon atoms also. Like this one here has some hydrogen atoms in addition to its carbons. That's fine. It's still an organic molecule as long as it has carbon atoms. And this molecule, same thing. In addition to the carbons and atoms, it also has hydrogen atoms and nitrogen atom and some oxygen atoms. That's fine. It still qualifies as an organic molecule as long as it has carbon atoms in it. Now notice that in the organic molecules that I've shown you so far, the carbons are linked together. Like this carbon links to that carbon, and that carbon links to that carbon, by covalent bonds. The carbons are linked together. And that's the way it is with most organic molecules. The carbon atoms are linked together, so they sort of form a central chain of the organic molecule. And the term for that is the carbon backbone of the molecule. In an organic molecule, the linked together carbon atoms form what they call the backbone of the organic molecule. Now, interestingly, in some organic molecules, the carbon backbone links back on itself to form a ring. Like you can see in this organic molecule, the carbons link to form a six-membered ring of carbon atoms. And the reason I'm pointing that out is if that's the type of organic molecule it is, where the carbons link together to form a ring, when they're showing the molecular structure of it, sometimes they take a shortcut and they just sketch out the shape of the ring. So if in this class I'm talking about the molecular structure of a molecule and all you see is just sort of a geometric ring-shaped structure like this, you might say, well, that's not a molecular structure. Molecular structures are supposed to show atoms. Well, just realize that's a shorthand way of showing organic molecules where the backbone forms a ring. And so if you see something like that, just realize every corner is a carbon. Like you can see here, there are 6 corners, and so that represents this where there are 6 carbon atoms in the backbone that form a ring. And just to give an example of where ring-shaped organic molecules are shown just showing the ring, not any of the actual carbon atoms. Here's an example: cholesterol. We'll talk about this molecule later on, but you can see in this molecular structure diagram, most of the carbons are not shown, but they show the rings here. So again, every corner is a carbon if they're showing the ring structures like that. Carbon, 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 carbon. And likewise, this molecule here, same thing. If you see this, you should recognize it's an organic molecule, and every corner is a carbon, 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 carbon. Okay, I think you get the idea. Now, some organic molecules in our body are relatively small, like this one you see right here only has 3 carbons in its carbon backbone, 1, 2, 3. Other organic molecules inside of us are huge. Other organic molecules might have hundreds or even thousands of carbon atoms all linked together in its backbone. Well, there's a term for these really big organic molecules that are found inside living things, and they are called the biological macromolecules. Macro means big, so it literally means the big molecules of living things, the biological macromolecules. And in your lecture handout, it defines them this way: the large organic molecules that are vital components of all living things. As it turns out, there are 4 major types of these macromolecules found in the human body and in all living things. And here's the list of them. The 4 types of macromolecules are carbohydrates, lipids, proteins, and nucleic acids. So whenever you think of any of these 4 macromolecules, picture just a really huge molecule. Now, they're still too small to see with the naked eye or even with a microscope, but in relative to molecule sizes, they are very, very large molecules. And so, other than water molecules, these are the major molecules of living things. In other words, if you could somehow subtract out all the water molecules from the human body, almost all the molecules that would be left would be these macromolecules that you see listed here. Okay, so picture these as all 4 of these macromolecule types as being just really huge molecules. All of them are polymers. And you might say, well, what the heck does that mean? Well, let me start off with kind of an analogy. These things towards the top of the screen here are a type of little kid's toy called pop beads. And you can see they have these little ends so they can click together with each other. So little kids can take these and click them together to make chains like you see here and here. Well, anytime you have something like that, anytime you have an object, a small object that can click together with other such small objects to make longer chains, the small objects that get clicked together can be called monomers. Here we go. So those little individual pop beads are monomers. And when you make a long chain by linking monomer objects together, the long chain that you get is called a polymer. And so this polymer right here is made out of 5 monomers linked together. And this polymer right there is made out of 4 of the monomers linked together. And so what I'm saying is, for the 4 macromolecules, all 4, the carbohydrates, proteins, lipids, and nucleic acids, they're all polymers. They're all big molecules, but all of them are made out of some monomers that got linked together. So think of monomers as kind of the building blocks of the 4 macromolecules. And incidentally, notice that there's no theoretical limit to how many monomers you can link together, because they're sort of designed to link together to each other, right? So you can get a polymer that's made up of dozens or hundreds or even thousands of monomer objects all linked together. Okay, so when you picture the 4 biological macromolecules, picture them all as polymers. Each one is made out of some smaller molecules called the monomers that are linked together. Well, as it turns out, each of the 4 macromolecule types has its own particular monomer type. So for carbohydrate macromolecules, their monomers are called monosaccharides. So when you think of carbohydrates, think of a whole bunch of these monosaccharide monomers all linked together. And for protein macromolecules, their monomers, I can just show you like this. So when we talk about carbohydrates, think of those as a macromolecule, and their monomers are called the monosaccharides. And for proteins, they're a macromolecule, so they are a polymer, and their monomers are called the amino acids. And so, yes, if this were a protein, the individual monomers that it's built out of are called amino acids. So a protein is just a chain of amino acid monomers all linked together. And I could go on, like for nucleic acids, for example, they are the macromolecule, and so they are a polymer of monomers, and the monomers of nucleic acids are called nucleotides. So when you think of a nucleic acid, think of, that's not the right picture I was looking for. Go back. There we go. When you think of a nucleic acid, think of a bunch of nucleotide monomers all joined together. Okay, so just to summarize up to this point, there are 4 macromolecule types, which are the major molecules of the human body and other living things. Other than water, these are the major molecules of the human body, and each one is a polymer made out of linking some monomers together, and each one has its own monomer type. Okay, so what we're going to do now is go through the 4 macromolecules one at a time, starting with the carbohydrates. And for each one, we're going to talk about a little bit about the structure of its monomer, and a little bit about what the functions of the monomers and the macromolecules, each of the macromolecules are in the human body. As I said, we will begin with the carbohydrate macromolecules and their monomers. Okay, so the monomers of the carbohydrates are called the monosaccharides. Here's a nice sketch of a monosaccharide. Now, if I were to show you this sketch that you see here of a monosaccharide, and I ask you to guess how many carbons you think it had, what do you think the answer would be? Well, if you remember that when molecular structures are shown is sort of a ring shape, you should assume every corner is a carbon. And so since this ring has 6 corners, you should guess that it has 6 carbons. And that's about right. Not all monosaccharides have 6 carbons, but many of them do. Okay, so anyway, monosaccharides are the monomers of the carbohydrates. Monosaccharides are sometimes also called the simple sugars because they are sugars. If someone gave you a spoonful of purified monosaccharide and you put it in your mouth, it would taste sweet. It's a sugar. So all monosaccharides are sugars. Okay, now the major function of monosaccharides is that they are the fuel for cells. Just like your car needs to take in gasoline as its fuel, as its energy fuel to keep running, cells take in monosaccharides as their major fuel molecule to give themselves energy to keep running. Okay, so just make a mental note of that somewhere. The major function of monosaccharides is that they are the fuel for your cells to provide energy to keep your cells running. Okay, so that little diagram there will represent a monosaccharide. Well, remember that monosaccharides are the monomers of the carbohydrate family, and monomers are molecules that are designed to link together with each other. When you have 2 monosaccharides that get linked together, that have been linked together, that molecule is called a disaccharide. The prefix di means 2, so the name literally is telling you that it's made out of 2 monosaccharides linked together. And also within the carbohydrate family of molecules are things called polysaccharides, which are many monosaccharides linked together. And you might ask, well, how many? Well, there's no set number. With some polysaccharides, it might be hundreds of monosaccharides all linked together. And with other polysaccharides, it might be thousands of monosaccharides all linked together. Okay, so, depending on the number of monosaccharides, it might be, you might be talking about just a monosaccharide if there's just one, but if 2 are linked together, we call that molecule a disaccharide, and if many are linked together, we call that a polysaccharide. All of these molecules that you see here are within the carbohydrate family of molecules. So the term carbohydrate can refer to a monosaccharide, or it can refer to a disaccharide, or it can refer to a polysaccharide. But only the monosaccharides and the disaccharides are sugars. Only the monosaccharides and the disaccharides taste sweet to us. the polysaccharides don't taste sweet. And I always thought that was interesting and almost paradoxical because, the polysaccharides are made out of monosaccharides. So since monosaccharides are sweet, you would think a whole chain of them linked together would be even more sweet. But for some reason, it works the opposite way. Polysaccharides are not sugars. They do not taste sweet to us. Okay, well, we are going to focus in on the monosaccharides first. The best example of a monosaccharide is glucose, which is what you see shown here. Its molecular structure is shown here. Now, why do I say that glucose is the best example of a monosaccharide? Well, it's the most abundant monosaccharide that there is. There's far more glucose in your body than any other types of monosaccharides in your body. Now, you don't have to memorize the exact molecular structure of glucose. I'm not going to ask you to draw out the glucose molecule here on a quiz or anything. But I do want you to know a few things about it, nevertheless. I do want you to know its molecular formula. And so remember how you make molecular formulas. If I show you a molecule, molecular formulas are, the shorthand way of representing it with the atomic symbols all pushed together and the little subscript numbers to say how many there are of each atom in the molecule. So if I were to ask you to make the molecular formula of glucose, hopefully you'll be able to do that. You could look at it here and say, okay, it looks like there are 6 carbons and 12 hydrogens and 6 oxygens. And so, yes, the molecular formula of glucose is C6H12O6. And I do want you to memorize glucose's molecular formula. We're going to be talking about glucose enough this semester that you need to memorize its molecular formula, C6H12O6. Okay, now notice there's an interesting pattern there. Notice that in glucose, the number of carbons is equal to the number of oxygens, and the number of hydrogens is twice that, right? The number of carbons is 6, the number of oxygens is 6, so they're equal to each other, and the number of hydrogens is twice that, 12 hydrogens. Well, that pattern, where the number of carbons in the molecule equals the number of oxygens and the number of hydrogens is twice that number, that pattern is the defining trait of all monosaccharides. So if you look in the lecture handout for this lecture, that's what it gives as the definition for monosaccharides. They are any small molecule that has the general formula where the number of carbons equals the number of oxygens and the number of hydrogens is twice that. In the lecture handout, I said CN H2N ON, where N can represent any number. So just to show you this, here's this molecular formula for glucose. It fits the pattern, right? The number of carbons is equal to the number of oxygens, the number of hydrogens is twice that. So since it fits that pattern, that tells you that glucose by definition is a monosaccharide. And there's a different monosaccharide, as a different example, called ribose. And yeah, it has a different number of carbons than glucose does, and a different number of hydrogens than glucose does, and a different number of oxygens than glucose does. But notice it still fits the pattern. For ribose, the number of carbons is equal to the number of oxygens, and the number of hydrogens is twice that. So if it fits that pattern, it's a monosaccharide, and if it's a monosaccharide, it fits that pattern. To see if you're getting the concept here, let me give you a drill question here. Let me just say that I've discovered a new monosaccharide, and it has 3 carbons in it. And then I say, okay, tell me the molecular formula for the whole molecule. Okay, so what you should say to yourself is, okay, I know it has 3 carbons, and just by definition, the molecular formula of any monosaccharide is number of carbons is equal to the number of oxygens, and the number of hydrogens is twice that. So you would say, Mr. Edens, the molecular formula for your monosaccharide is C3H6O3, because that's the pattern. Okay, good. Let's move on then. So getting back to glucose, remember I said glucose is the best example of a monosaccharide because it is by far the most abundant monosaccharide in our bodies. Well, just to keep my diagram simple, instead of showing the full molecular structure of glucose here, for the rest of this lecture I'm just going to show it like this. Kind of a green ring-shaped molecule that says glucose. Just to sort of remind you that it is a ring-shaped molecule. Anyway, so for the rest of the lecture, that's how I'm going to be representing glucose. Okay, a few more things about glucose. Glucose is our blood sugar. What that means is that your blood has a pretty high concentration of glucose in it. And the reason that your blood has so much glucose in it is that glucose is the favorite fuel molecule of your cells. I mentioned earlier that monosaccharides are the favorite fuel molecule of your cells. Well, that's still true, but now I'm being a little bit more specific. Glucose in particular is the favorite fuel molecule of your cells. And so that's really the purpose of your blood having glucose in it, is so that your cells can get the glucose from the blood so that the cells can have a fuel molecule, to give themselves energy. Now, glucose is not the only monosaccharide. There are other monosaccharides. Just to name some examples, there's a monosaccharide called fructose. There's a monosaccharide called galactose. There's a monosaccharide called ribose. Notice that all of their names end in ose, O-S-E. And so if you see any molecule that ends in ose, it's either going to be a monosaccharide or a disaccharide. The ose ending is sort of biological language for a sugar, and monosaccharides and disaccharides are the sugars. Now, remember that the carbohydrate family is more than just the monosaccharides. The carbohydrate family also includes larger molecules where the monosaccharides have become linked together. And the first one of those that we'll consider are called the disaccharides. A disaccharide is a carbohydrate molecule made of two monosaccharides linked together. And just to give an example of a disaccharide, maltose is a good example. A maltose is a disaccharide carbohydrate made of two glucoses linked together. But not all disaccharides are two glucoses linked together, because remember that there are several types of monosaccharides. There's glucose, there's ribose, there's fructose, there's galactose, just to name a few types of monosaccharides. And so just to give you an example of a different disaccharide, there's a disaccharide that's made of a glucose monosaccharide linked to a fructose monosaccharide, and that monosaccharide is called sucrose, and that's the same as table sugar. The sugar that you buy at a grocery store is sucrose disaccharide. Each sugar molecule is made out of one glucose monosaccharide linked to one sucrose monosaccharide. Okay, and I think I mentioned already that the monosaccharides and the disaccharides are both sugars. They both, taste sweet if you eat them. Which brings us to the next member of the carbohydrate family, the polysaccharides. Polysaccharides are a large number of glucoses linked together. And remember that, interestingly, polysaccharides are not sugars. They don't taste sweet when you eat them. And I always thought that was kind of strange, because they're made out of monosaccharides, and monosaccharides are sweet, so you would think polysaccharides taste sweet, but they don't. Anyway, so a polysaccharide is a large number of glucoses linked together. And so that's the monosaccharide type that polysaccharides are made out of, glucoses. Living things make polysaccharides as a way of storing energy, because remember that glucose is the major fuel molecule for cells. And so when any living thing has more glucoses than it needs to, for its cells at that moment, the living things want to store up those glucoses to meet their future energy needs. So living things link the glucoses together, and that's why living things make polysaccharides as a way of storing their glucose energy. So here's a little animated view of a polysaccharide. It's just glucose after glucose after glucose after glucose linked together. Oh yeah, so you might wonder, well, how many glucoses? Well, there's no set number. Some polysaccharides might be hundreds of glucoses linked together. Some polysaccharides might be thousands of glucoses linked together. And incidentally, the animation that I'm showing you here, it looks like the glucoses are all linked together in just a straight chain. And that's a bit of a simplification. In real life, what you find is some side chains of glucoses branching off from the main chain. But don't let that minor complication distract you from the big point that polysaccharides are just a bunch of glucoses linked together. Okay, now there are two types of polysaccharides, and they are called starch and glycogen. And at first you might say, wait a minute, you just told us polysaccharides are a bunch of glucoses all linked together. How can there be more than one type? Aren't they just all glucoses? And yeah, it's true, all polysaccharides are glucoses linked together. But the two types, starch and glycogen, the two types of polysaccharides, are named for what type of organism links those glucoses together. If the polysaccharide is made in a plant, in other words, if a plant linked the glucoses together, we call that polysaccharide starch. Whereas if the glucoses were linked together in an animal's body, then we call the molecule glycogen. So that's the difference between starch polysaccharide and glycogen polysaccharide. Was it made in a plant or was it made in an animal? And incidentally, humans are part of the animal kingdom, and so when our bodies link glucoses together, we call that molecule glycogen. Okay, but let's focus on starch. So if a plant links those glucoses together, the polysaccharide is called starch. Some plant types are naturally high in starch, and we human beings are interested in eating those because we want the energy from the glucoses in that plant starch. So over the course of human history, humans have cultivated plants that are high in starch. And so just to give some examples, wheat is high in starch. And so all the foods that we get from wheat, like pasta and bread and breakfast cereals, are starchy foods. Potatoes are very high in starch, and so if you eat a potato, you're eating a lot of starch. Rice is high in starch. Corn is high in starch. These are all very, very starchy foods. Now, interestingly, when I was a kid, they told us to eat a lot of starch. They said it should be the main source of calories in your diet, and they showed it to us this way. They said starches should be the base of your food pyramid in terms of what you should eat the most of every day. And interestingly, over the past few decades, starch has sort of fallen into disfavor among nutritionists. Some nutritionists think that our bodies convert starch too easily into fat, so they tell us to eat less starch. And is that true? Well, I don't know. I'm not a nutritionist. From what I understand, most nutritionists would say you should get some starch in your diet, but they would say emphasize the brown starches like brown bread and brown rice, and not the white starches, like white breads and white rice. Okay, so remember that, yes, if a plant links the glucoses together, we call that molecule starch. But if the human body or any other member of the animal kingdom links those glucoses together, we call the molecule glycogen. Now, remember I said that even though I'm not showing it here in real life, there's some branching side chains, shorter chains of glucoses that branch off from the main chain. Glycogen is actually slightly more branched than starch is. But again, don't let that minor molecular difference distract you from the main similarity that both glycogen and starch are just big, long polymers of glucose. Okay, yes, so when our bodies want to store glucose, our bodies link it together, and we call that molecule glycogen. The two main areas of the body that store the most glycogen are the liver, which you see right here, and the muscles, which aren't really illustrated in this diagram. But yes, so inside your liver cells and inside your muscle cells are large amounts is where large amounts of glycogen are stored. Okay, that finishes up our discussion of carbohydrate macromolecules. Let me do an ultra quick recap on it. The monomers of the carbohydrates are called monosaccharides, and the most abundant of the monosaccharides is called glucose. Glucose is our blood sugar, and it's the favorite fuel molecule for our cells. The polymers of those monosaccharides can be called disaccharides if two monosaccharides have become linked together, and polysaccharides if many of the glucose monosaccharides have been linked together. And there are two major types of polysaccharides. There is starch, which is where plants link together the glucose monosaccharides, and there is glycogen, where animals link together the glucose polysaccharides. Okay, very good. We will now move on to the second of the four macromolecule types, the lipids. So before we talk about what the lipids are at a molecular level, let me just quickly show you some familiar day-to-day things that are made out of these lipid molecules. And you see them here. These are oils, and these represents fats. Like there's some cooking lard and some butter, which is milk fat, and some cheese, which is also milk fat. Okay, so yeah, so these are everyday substances that are made primarily of lipid molecules. Now, what do all these substances have in common? They are hydrophobic. For instance, with oils, if you tried to pour them into a glass of water, they wouldn't mix at all. And that's the trait of hydrophobic substances. They don't mix with water. And so that is actually the defining trait of the lipid macromolecules, is that they are hydrophobic macromolecules. Now, in our lecture on water, we learned about the characteristics of hydrophobic molecules. In other words, we learned what characteristic of a molecule makes it hydrophobic. And remember from that lecture, the answer was this: any molecule where there are large regions of the molecule that have only carbon and hydrogen atoms in them is going to be a hydrophobic molecule. And so that's what makes lipid macromolecules hydrophobic, is large regions of them have just carbons and hydrogens. What you see in this diagram here is a diagram of an oil or fat molecule. And yeah, you can see some regions over here do have some oxygen, so those regions there are not just carbons and hydrogens, but the majority of the molecule is just carbons and hydrogens. Therefore, that trait makes it a hydrophobic molecule. Okay, so I think hopefully you have a sense that lipids are the hydrophobic molecules, and at a molecular level, why lipids are hydrophobic macromolecules. Let's talk about the functions of lipids. So one of the major functions of lipid macromolecules is that they are for energy storage. Fats and oils, which are examples of lipids, just naturally have a lot of calories, have a lot of energy in them. And so living things, including the human body, store calories in fats. Another thing that lipids are used for is insulation, to help keep our body heat in. We all have a layer of fat just under our skin to help keep us warm. And lastly, another major function of lipids is that the molecules that form the membranes of our cells are a type of lipid molecule. Okay, well, so they are the functions of lipids: energy storage, insulation, and cell membranes. So lipids are macromolecules, and remember that all macromolecules are polymers, meaning all macromolecules are made by linking smaller molecules together that we call the monomers. So let's talk about what the monomers of lipid macromolecules are. Well, lipids are actually a very diverse family of macromolecules, but for most lipids, there are two monomer type of molecules, and these are called fatty acids and glycerol. Yes, so for most lipids, fatty acid and glycerol are the monomers. Let's first talk about the fatty acid monomers of lipids. So this figure shows a typical fatty acid molecule, and as you notice, a vast majority of the molecule is just carbons and hydrogens, and so from what you know about molecular structures, you would say, yes, that's going to be a hydrophobic molecule. And yes, so fatty acids are hydrophobic. And they call that part of the fatty acid molecule, the part that's just this long region of just carbons and hydrogens, they call that the hydrophobic tail of the fatty acid. Now, in this diagram, the entire fatty acid molecule its carbon backbone looks like around 8 carbons. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. fatty acids actually can vary in length in terms of how long their um, the carbon backbone of their fatty acid is. But anyway, so what I'm saying is fatty acids are not always necessarily 8 carbons in length. An average fatty acid is actually 18 carbons in length. So this one's actually kind of on the smallest side. And another thing about fatty acids, notice if you look at the carbon backbone here in the hydrophobic tail of the fatty acid, there's only a single covalent bond between each carbon in the hydrophobic tail. In some fatty acids, you might see a double covalent bond between some of the carbons. Here we go. If you look at this bottom fatty acid right here, you can see that it does have a double covalent bond between two of the carbons in the tail. And if that's the case, you say that it is an unsaturated fatty acid. But if it has no double bonds between any of the carbons in its fatty acid tail, in its hydrophobic tail, you say that it is a saturated fatty acid. So this is a saturated fatty acid, and this is a saturated fatty acid, but this is an unsaturated fatty acid. Okay, so fatty acids are one of the monomers of lipid macromolecules. The other monomer, is called a glycerol molecule, and here's a picture of it. Notice that it has 3 carbons in its carbon backbone, and that's true of all glycerol molecules. Glycerol just always is a 3-carbon molecule. And as I'll show you a little bit later here in a moment, each carbon can be a docking site for one fatty acid. In other words, up to 3 fatty acids can link onto one glycerol molecule. Okay, so glycerol and fatty acids are the building blocks of most lipids. There are 3 major types of lipids. So within the lipid macromolecule family, there are 3 major types of lipids, and we call these the triglycerides, the phospholipids, and the steroids. So what I'm going to do is go through these 3 types of lipids one at a time, and for each one, we'll talk about its molecular structure and what its functions are in the body. Okay, let's start discussing the triglyceride lipids. The triglycerides are fats and oils. In other words, the molecules that all fats and all oils are made out of are triglyceride molecules. And so where do we find fats and oils in our body? Well, we have fats stored at various places around our body. So all your body fat is made out of triglyceride molecules. And we also have some oils in our body. For instance, there are some oils on your skin that are just naturally part of your skin. Those are also triglyceride molecules. Now, what is the purpose of these triglyceride molecules in our body? In other words, what's the purpose of the fats and oils? Well, at least as far as the fats, energy storage. Fats, in other words, triglyceride molecules just naturally are high energy molecules. And so if you take in more calories, more energy in your diet than your body needs, your body wants to store those calories, and so your body does so by manufacturing triglyceride molecules, fat molecules. Now, another thing that your body uses fats, triglyceride molecules for, in addition to energy storage, is insulation. Fat helps hold in your body heat. The fat that's used for insulation is a layer that's just under your skin. This next slide shows some surgery where they opened up the skin, and you can see there's kind of a whitish, yellowish layer right under the surface of the skin right there. That's called the subcutaneous fat layer. And yes, its purpose is to insulate us, to hold in body heat. All right, so I've been talking about the fats, the triglyceride molecules in our body, but other living things, including plants, also manufacture triglycerides. So the oils that we use for cooking, corn oil, vegetable oil, whatnot, are made out of triglyceride molecules. And animal fats for other types of animals other than humans are also made out of triglycerides. Cooking lard comes from pig fat. Butter comes from
milk fat as does the fat that you find in cheeses. Yeah, so all fats and oils, their molecules are triglyceride molecules. Okay, let me show you what the molecular structure of a triglyceride molecule is. So if a living thing, including in humans, if a living thing cells want to manufacture a triglyceride molecule, the cell starts off with a glycerol molecule, like you see here, and three fatty acids join onto it, one to each of the carbons of the glycerol. And so, yes, if a cell wants to make a triglyceride, it starts with a glycerol and it brings in the first fatty acid, which clicks onto the first carbon, and then a second fatty acid comes in that clicks onto the second carbon of the glycerol, and then a third fatty acid comes in and that it clicks onto the third carbon of the glycerol. And so there is the molecular structure of a triglyceride molecule. Each triglyceride is made out of one glycerol and three fatty acids joined onto that glycerol. Here is the textbook's picture of a triglyceride molecule. There you see the glycerol right there and the three fatty acids that are joined onto it. Oh, notice that it's perfectly okay for some of the fatty acids on the triglyceride to be unsaturated and other fatty acids on the triglyceride to be saturated. Okay, well, so just to recap, triglyceride lipids are the molecules that fats and oils are built out of. Let's now move on to the second type of lipid macromolecule that we're going to talk about, which are the phospholipids. So the function of these is pretty straightforward. They are the major molecules that cell membranes are built out of. Here's a artist's depiction of a cell, and the outer part of the cell is called the cell membrane. And yes, the major molecules that cell membranes are built out of are called phospholipids. So let's talk about the molecular structure of phospholipids now. So if a cell wants to construct a phospholipid, to make a phospholipid, the cell starts off with a glycerol molecule, which you see right here, and then the cell links onto the glycerol molecule two fatty acids. Here comes the first fatty acid, and here comes the second fatty acid. But on the third carbon of the glycerol molecule, if it's a phospholipid, it's not a fatty acid that joins onto that carbon, it's a phosphate ion. So remember, the phosphate ions are a phosphorus atom surrounded by four oxygens. And yes, if the cell is making a if the cell is making a phospholipid molecule, it's a phosphate ion that attaches onto that third carbon of the glycerol. So here you see the molecular structure of a phospholipid. It's made out of one glycerol attached to two fatty acids and one phosphate ion. Oh, so you may wonder, well, what's that little question mark thing there? Well, there are always some other atoms attached to this part of the phosphate ion. Some more carbons and hydrogens and nitrogens and other atoms. But exactly what atoms are attached there varies quite a bit from one phospholipid to another. So basically, don't worry about what other atoms are attached right there, because that varies from one phospholipid to another. All right, well, let me show you the textbook's picture of a phospholipids molecular structure. Here it is. Here you see, in this orange box, here you see the glycerol, the three-carbon, monomer of lipids. And here you see two fatty acids attached to two of the carbons of that glycerol. But remember, on the third carbon of the glycerol, it's a phosphate ion that's attached, if you're talking about a phospholipid molecule. Oh yeah, and here they're showing some of those other atoms that are attached to the other side of the phosphate, but like I said, don't worry about that. It's the only important part you have to know is that each phospholipid is made out of one glycerol attached to two fatty acids and one phosphate ion. Okay, now, remember, fatty acids are very hydrophobic because each fatty acid has that long hydrophobic tail, whereas phosphate ions, being an ion, are very hydrophilic. Ions are just naturally very hydrophilic. And so phospholipids are kind of a schizophrenic molecule. The area around here where they have their phosphate is very hydrophilic, very water-loving, but the two fatty acids are very hydrophobic. They don't like water. So each phospholipid has a very hydrophilic region and two hydrophobic regions where the fatty acid tails are. And for that reason, biologists often use sort of a shorthand way to diagram phospholipids. And it's like this. Biologists represent phospholipids by drawing a circle with two tails sticking out of it. The circle represents the phosphate ion, the hydrophilic part of the phospholipid, and the two lines sticking out of the circle represent the two fatty acids. So that's the hydrophobic part of the phospholipid. Yeah, so whenever you see that, a circle with two little lines sticking out of it, just recognize that that's a phospholipid, that's the hydrophilic part, and the two tails sticking out are the hydrophobic tails of the two fatty acids. All right, so I guess I just told you a moment ago, the major job of phospholipid molecules is that they are the major building block molecule of cell membranes. Let's imagine zooming in on a cell membrane so we can see the phospholipids. Zooming in, zooming in, zooming in. Good. So yes, here you see the phospholipids that the cell membrane is made out of. But notice that their arrangement, it's not just a single layer of phospholipid. Each cell membrane, or I should say all cell membranes, are made out of what they call a phospholipid bilayer. So there's one layer of phospholipids here, kind of pointing towards the outside of the cell, and there's a second layer of phospholipids here, pointing towards the interior of the cell. Yeah, so cell membranes are phospholipid bilayers, meaning two layers of phospholipids. And notice that both layers together, their hydrophobic part, the fatty acid tails, all point together towards the interior of the membrane. So this middle part of the membrane is going to be the hydrophobic part, right? And that relates to the function of cell membranes. The major function of cell membranes is to be barriers that stop solutes from passing through. Like, for instance, imagine there's a sodium ion on the outside of the cell. The membrane's job is to be a barrier to stop that from entering the cell. And how that works is this. Remember that solutes tend to be hydrophilic, whereas the interior of the membrane, thanks to those fatty acid tails, is hydrophobic. And we know from the like mixes with like principle that hydrophilic things don't want to mix with hydrophobic things. And so that's how the cell membrane is a barrier, because of its hydrophobic interior, it repels most solutes, which are hydrophobic, from passing through. There you go. Yeah, that hydrophilic solute does not want to mix with the hydrophobic interior of the membrane, and so the membrane is able to be a barrier to stop solutes from passing through. And likewise, solutes on the inside of the cell are not going to be able to escape out of the cell by passing through the membrane, again, because the membrane interior is hydrophobic and most solutes are hydrophilic. And another class of hydrophilic molecules you might remember are carbohydrates, like glucose. So if the cell, let's say, has a glucose molecule inside of it, that glucose will not be able to escape out of the cell because the membrane is a barrier, and it's a barrier because its interior is hydrophobic. So, super quick summary. Phospholipids are the major building block of cell membranes. The third of the major lipid types are called the steroid lipids, and steroids are different from the other two. Steroids are quite a bit different from triglycerides and phospholipids. And what I mean by that is, remember that triglycerides and phospholipids were similar in molecular structure. Triglycerides and phospholipids both contained a glycerol that was linked to some fatty acids. So glycerol and fatty acids are the monomers, the major building blocks of triglyceride and phospholipid lipids. Steroids are different. Steroids are not built out of glycerol and fatty acids. They have a completely different molecular structure than these other two types of lipids. So what is the molecular structure of steroid lipids? And here it is. This is called the steroid backbone. And let me explain what it is. Remember that when you see a molecular structure of a molecule and it looks like some ring structures, that's the sort of shorthand way of saying that the carbon backbone of the molecule links to itself to form ring structures. And so this is described as 4 fused rings of carbons. You can see that there are 4 rings here. 1, 2, 3, 4 rings of carbon all linked together. Anyway, yeah, so this is called the steroid backbone. It's described as 4 fused rings of carbon. And remember, every corner is a carbon. So there's a carbon, there's a carbon, 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 carbon. I think if you were to total them all up, there are a total of 17 carbons in the steroid backbone. Okay, so yeah, this steroid backbone is the defining trait of steroid lipids. If it's a steroid lipid, it has this backbone. If it has this backbone, it's a steroid lipid. Now, there are several different types of steroid lipids, and you may say, well, wait a minute, if they all have this steroid backbone, how can there be different types? Well, steroids differ from each other depending on what molecules are attached to the steroid backbone. So now let me show you an example. Here are 2 steroids. This one's called cholesterol, and this one's called testosterone. They both have the steroid backbone, as you can see, but they differ in what atoms are attached onto that steroid backbone. For example, right here in this cholesterol steroid, there's an oxygen and a hydrogen attached to that particular carbon, and here there's just an oxygen attached to that particular carbon in testosterone. Okay, your lecture handout lists several different examples of steroids, including cholesterol, testosterone. It's not shown in this picture, but estrogen and progesterone and corticosterone and vitamin D are also steroid lipids. While I've got cholesterol shown right here, let me mention a few things about it. One function of cholesterol in our body is it forms part of cell membranes. And you may say, wait a minute, Mr. Edens, you told us that phospholipids are what cell membranes are made out of. And yes, your cell membranes are mostly made out of phospholipids, but your cell membranes also contain some of this cholesterol steroid within the membrane. Another thing about cholesterol is if you get too much cholesterol in your diet, it can clog your arteries. That disease is called atherosclerosis, where your arteries get clogged. What I'm saying is that cholesterol certainly has normal, healthy functions in the body. For instance, it's one of the molecules in your cell membranes, but too much of it in your diet is a bad thing. It can give you atherosclerosis. All right. Well, another type of or function of steroids in your body is that many of them are hormones. I guess I listed some here. Testosterone is a hormone, a steroid hormone. This next slide shows some other hormones: estrogen, progesterone, aldosterone, cortisol. All these are hormones, and they are steroid hormones. Now, not all hormones are steroid hormones. There are some hormones that are not steroids, but many of your hormones are steroids. Okay, so that leads us to the end of the lipid macromolecules. If I had to just briefly summarize them, they are all hydrophobic macromolecules, and most of them are built out of glycerol and fatty acids as their monomers, but not the steroid lipids. They have that steroid backbone, and some functions, or the 3 subcategories of lipids. Macromolecules are the triglycerides, the phospholipids, and the steroids.
Okay, this is the stopping point for the part 1 of this lecture of biological macromolecules. Now please start the second part, which is entitled Lecture 4B, for the rest of this lecture.